This is Brian Putt coming to you from my home here at the end of April. It was back a month ago on April 26th that I did a video about the reliability of COVID testing. And since then, there's been a lot more discussion around the testing and even something around the relative reliability. But very few numbers are coming out on the reliability. What I've done is to expand that analysis now and to include a time series of events where we have continuous testing. And as the people get tested, they get into isolation, they come out, and let's assume they're immune. I'll go over this in a little bit. So, one of the problems with our current isolating in place is that we don't have a lot of people that understand what the idea is. Here are some ridiculous situations. I don't want to go through all of these, but you can see that they don't make much sense. Particularly here, the Corona beer. Obviously, it's impacted and will give you the disease. So it's not. No one's buying Corona beer. Anyway, let's talk about the reliability. We're relying on a good COVID-19 test to confirm whether you have the virus or not. But according to the reports below, the test is highly unreliable. There's two factors that come into play here. One's the sensitivity. That's the one most often talked about, which is a positive result from the test given that you're actually infected. And this could be 40%, it could be up to 70%, but not really much higher than that. And the specificity, which is given a negative result, given that you're not infected, which they tend to believe is much more reliable, so it's in the 90 to 95%. In my analysis, I've used this reliability table, so the sensitivity is only 40%. And I actually am going to do a sensitivity to that to look at different ranges. They're coming out along these rapid tests now that are only 15 minutes, or maybe a little bit longer. We're getting to these tests en masse. These tests are less sensitive and uncertain about the technology that is accepted to all countries where the infection is present. Someone today was telling me it takes 4 years to come up with a vaccine. And they're talking about having something at 2021. So on March 29th, the Spanish scientists said that the rapid tests for coronavirus they reviewed were less than 30% accurate, and whereas more established tests were 84%. It's interesting. The one thing worse than no tests at all is a bad test. Because you get tested and you test positive, well, you still don't know whether you really have it or not because of all the false positives. And if you turn out negative, you could still have it because of the false negatives. So what does the test do? Would you really want to take a test if you didn't have any symptoms? So here's another one. In April 2nd, 1 in 3 patients who are infected are nevertheless getting a negative test result. So let's go over and look at the forecast model. So let's start with the influence diagram. We have the population in the United States, around 330 million people. We have the percent of the population at the beginning of this time series model with COVID. And based on some data I have, it would suggest that maybe out of the entire population, it's 0.8%. Now, this is not looking at the percent of people that we've tested currently because we're selectively testing those that have symptoms. But if you took the entire population, it might be like 0.8%. So let's assume that. You have the rate of testing, which could change over the time. So am I doing 20,000 tests a day or 100,000 tests a day or 2 million tests a day? Okay, something of that nature. And then there's the initial, that's actually the initial testing rate. And then there's a rate of testing changes. So I could increase it at 10% or 20%, let's say every week. And so with all that, I can come up with these test results. And out of the test results, I put people into 4 different categories. One is they're isolated because they had a positive reaction, but they're really not infected. Or they had a positive and they are really infected. or they had a negative reaction they're positively infected, but they're sent home, or they had a negative reaction, so they're sent home and they actually did not have COVID. If in this case, in this bottom one, where they didn't have COVID but they had a negative response, we just send them back to the population. If in fact they tested positively and they did have COVID, they've gone into the immune population after a 14-day quarantine. This group of people also get quarantined for 14 days and eventually come back to the population. And then we have the transmission rate per person. And this is not the typical exponential thing. It's really talking about every person in a 2-week period that has COVID infects that many more people. All right, having said that, let's look at the model. Here's the 330 million people. 0.8% of them have COVID to start with. Let's look at it. There's a kind of a default testing rate here of 2,000, which is really 2 million per day. Looking at 7-day periods, we'll grow the test rate. Let's see, it's 5%, and the infection rate is 0.2. So every week, everyone who has COVID will infect 0.2 people. That's the growth rate. I mean, they could infect 3 people. We then have our conditional probability matrix. So this is positive, 0.8%, and 99.2% they're negative. They do not have COVID. And we'll identify them. People with COVID would identify with 70% accuracy and a 95% probability that we'll test negative if they don't have it. Let me just split my screen here. And so this is going to go out for 10 periods. And we do the calculations. We collect some output variables by periods, or every week. So here are the results of the model, showing the sensitivity to a number of variables. Let's start up here with the sensitivity percent. So this is talking about the reliability of the test for COVID. And what we've seen in the literature, what we've seen on the internet, is that the reliability is probably not much better than 70%. And it's more likely to be, down here in the 60 to 50 range. We're talking about 10 to 18 weeks before we hit the peak for a number of confirmed cases. Now let's come down here to the number of tests that we're conducting. The news talks about this all the time, and this is consistent with that. We had here 2,000. Well, that's really 2 million tests per day. So what is actually happening, though? In the United States, we've been conducting about 150,000 per day, and we've only tested 4 million people year to date. So we're not here, we're way back here. 150,000 a day. It's going to be a long time before we get to the peak. We were going to be testing a lot. We've been testing a lot of people that show symptoms, and what we're talking about here is testing the entire population. So if we don't have a very good rate today, well, what about growth in those tests per week? And here it shows the growth. And so we're talking about, pretty heavy growth. But the literature I was looking at says that some of the tests have actually, number of tests have actually gone down, the rate of testing. So we're going the wrong direction. And then there's the infection rate. And I'm not sure how to calibrate this one. Here we're talking about infecting 0.05 people in a week for everyone who has COVID. So really it's going to be very important that we continue to have our social distancing, wear our masks, and isolate where we can, minimizing contact with others. So these are the results that I was getting with my model. I'm happy to share the model with you. Just send me an email to brian@theputz.com. Thank you.